Testing listening. Why should we separate testing listening from testing speaking? Well, it's because it's possible to develop listening skills way beyond speaking. Listening and speaking are very different skills, and oftentimes they are mixed, they are integrated, but it's still very possible for somebody to have very good listening skills way beyond his or her speaking skills. That's why we separate testing listening from testing speaking. Now, that's very important. Okay. An important first prerequisite for testers who would test listening is knowledge of how the spoken language differs from the written one. Knowledge of how the spoken language differs from the written one is crucial for testers because you might be testing speaking, but your perspective is testing. You might be so sorry. You're testing listening, but you're actually testing reading. Your perspective is testing reading. That's why we need to discuss some characteristics of spoken speech. One important characteristic of spoken speech is redundancy. You already have grammatical structure and you have intonation of questions. So that's an example. It's already a question in terms of grammar, plus the intonation also signals that it's also a question. Okay? So like when you say, when are you coming back? So you have redundancy there. There's lots of redundancy, including gestures and facial expression. That's a characteristic of spoken speech, especially when you see the the speaker. Okay, so gestures, eye movements, slight changes in breathing, pauses, loudness, softness, quick rhythm, slow rhythm, that helps spoken speech. These help spoken speech. There's also repetition. Okay, you repeat a lot. You rephrase a lot. You repeat and you rephrase. Okay, there's also some hesitation. The hesitation would tell you how the speaker feels about what he or she said. Like, maybe, so the hesitation will tell you how does the speaker feel about what he is saying. He feels it's very true, very important, not so important, not so sure. Okay, that's the signal that hesitation gives. So, characteristics of spoken speech, you have redundancy, you have gestures, eye movements, slight changes in breathing, you have verbal and non-verbal, you have verbal and non-verbal additions, you have repetition, you have hesitation. Okay, as we said, rephrasing, you have grammatical repatterning, you rephrase something, you say something and you rephrase it. Okay, so that's a characteristic of spoken speech. Actually, natural spoken speech, not reading that's spoken out aloud. That's what we mean by spoken speech here. Okay, natural speech, not speech read from a piece of text. Okay, now those characteristics that we mentioned allow understanding even of mutilated speech. So even if the speech was not very well expressed, maybe they're ungrammatical, maybe they're not properly pronounced, there are things that compensate for mutilated speech. Redundancy, rephrasing, hesitation, gestures, all of them allow understanding even of mutilated speech. Okay, they compensate. Compensation occurs, like I said, which is why impromptu speech is usually easier to understand because of all of those compensatory devices, all those negotiation of meaning, all those clarifications, all those characteristics of natural spoken speech. Because impromptu speech tends to be more natural than a read speech. Okay. Now, carefully prepared materials like written speeches omit features of redundancy. You carefully prepared what you said. What happens is you omit features of redundancy. You remove all those characteristics. You minimize all those characteristics of natural speech that we were talking about. Okay? So carefully prepared materials like written speeches omit features of redundancy. This implies that prepared materials must be modified to make them good for reading aloud, including shorter segments and more pauses. So class, if you read the Old Testament, particularly the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Bible, the first five books of Israel, they were actually written to be read aloud. Okay, that's why when you read the Old Testament, particularly the Pentateuch, the books of the law, when you read them, how come they're structured like this? Well, they're intended for reading aloud. Like, for example, the Shema, you have, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. So it's intended to be read aloud. Okay, that's why prepared materials must be modified to make them good for reading aloud. You include shorter segments and more pauses. You know, class, traditionally, academics were encouraged to follow the written style of Greek and Latin, which include long sentences with many clauses and many phrases. That's written. Now, when you try to read that, it's quite difficult to understand. Okay, including John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So that's a long sentence because that's the way it is in Greek. Now, if you will say that, you'll probably break that down into shorter segments and even more pauses. Okay, and it is better if the speaker is seen by listeners. Disembodied recorded messages are harder to understand, all because the gestures and facial expression could not be seen. What you can just hear would be the verbal language, the verbal accompaniment, but the nonverbal is not seen. That's why it's much better if the speaker is seen by listeners. And that's also the reason why face to face communication is so much better than online video conferencing. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the use of recorders. Remember, we're testing listening here. Okay, we're testing listening. Many recorders are usually of poor quality. Okay, unless it's professionally done or done very well, recorders are usually of poor quality. For one thing, ordinary people don't have access to soundproof rooms. So there are cases where uh, something, some outside noise, some outside noise interfere with the recording, and maybe the recorders themselves have some problem. Okay, compared, this is of poor quality compared to face-to-face interaction. Okay, so this produces unreliability, especially when discrete features such as phoneme discrimination, stress, and intonation are being tested. Okay, so the test becomes unreliable because it would involve the listener's ability to listen well, instead of just listening to the actual content. Okay, so phoneme discrimination, the difference between e and it, stress like present and present, and intonation. When you test intonation, really, really, you are an English, uh, you're an English major, aren't you? You're an English major, aren't you? So that's intonation. Okay, when you test phoneme discrimination, stress, and intonation, the quality of the recording would be a very important factor. Sometimes it produces unreliability. Okay. However, class recorders produce uniformity because listeners listen to the same recording. So there's some sort of uniformity. Okay. Let's talk about strategies for phoneme discrimination tests. So this would be at the lower level. Maybe this would be at grade 6 or first year high school. Okay, here's an example. Again, we are talking about strategies, test strategies for phoneme discrimination tests. For example, you have a picture and you say something. So you show them this picture and you say A, pin, B, pen, C, pear, D, pain. Okay, so notice your pronunciation should be well done. Okay, so this is an example of a listening test. You have a picture and the students listen to what you say and write down the correct letter of the correct answer. So A, pin, B, pen, C, pear, D, pain. Okay, similarly, you have a picture and you say A, shack, B, sock, C, sack, D, shock. Needless to say, the teacher should be very good at pronunciation because if the teacher pronounces all these things similarly, that could be that would produce unreliability, especially in the Philippines. Okay, remember that. I don't know if you remember that saying, Paul, be careful, you might fall in the swimming pool. So you have the words Paul and the and the segment full, and you have fall, and you have pool. So Paul, be careful. You might fall into the swimming pool. But all of them are pronounced by Filipinos the same way. Paul, be careful. You might fall in the swimming pool. Or somebody from the Cordilleras said, it's hot outside my hut, so I brought a hat. It's hot, it's hot, outside my hut, so I brought a hat. So hot, hut, hat. But then teachers might pronounce them all the same way. It's hot outside my hut, so I brought a hat. Okay. In PNU, I encountered a teacher doing jazz chants with his or her students, and it was done the wrong way. It didn't follow the stress time rhythm of English. So there was the jazz chant was very wrong, incorrectly done. Okay, so you need to be careful in your speaking. So here's one kind of item, or it's the other way around. You say just one word and you show four different pictures. In the previous one, you have one picture and four different pronunciations. Here, what you have is you have one word that's pronounced and you have four pictures. So you say pen. You have a picture, letter A of a pin. You have letter B, a picture of a pen. You have a C, you have a picture of a pen. And in D, you have a picture of a pawn. Class PAWN is pawn. Okay, so this is the other way around. You have one word spoken and you have four pictures. The students choose the right picture by writing down the correct letter. Okay, or you can have the word used in a sentence. So testes identify which sentence is different from the others. A, there's a bend in the middle of the school. Sorry, letter A, there's a bend in the middle of the road. B, there's a bend in the middle of the road. C, there's a bend in the middle of the road. D, there's a bend in the middle of the road. Again, A, there's a bend in the middle of the road. B, there's a bend in the middle of the road. C, there's a bend in the middle of the road. D, there's a bend in the middle of the road. Okay, so in this way, the word is used in a particular sentence. Or you say something and the others are written down. Needless to say, this would be a much higher grade level than the use of pictures. Okay, so you say something, you say then, and then the students have written choices: A, then B, then C, then D, pen. Okay, needless to say, students here know how to read. Okay, they know how to read English. Okay, and another one is you have a word in a sentence. You say, I'll thread it for you. Again, I'll thread it for you. And the students are given either written or spoken choices. A, thread; B, thread; C, threat; D, dread. Okay, so the sentence is spoken. The word is in a sentence. Or you have a definition. Okay, so this helps focus more on the actual word. Needless to say, students need to be very good already at understanding the definition or meaning of words. Okay, so for example, you say caught two times. Caught, caught. So A, stopped and held. B, a baby's bed. C, pulled by horses. D, a small animal covered with fur. So, a baby's bed would be the answer. Stop and held. That's cop, cap, keep. Pulled by horses. That's a coach, maybe. Small animal covered with fur. That's a cat. Okay. So you have a spoken word and you have a definition. Needless to say, you need to be very good. Your students should be familiar with definitions. Otherwise, that would interfere with the test. Okay, you're not really testing the speaking, but the definition. Okay, so for testing listening, here are some principles. So avoid obscure lexical items. The problem with this is that not all sound contrasts needed may be actually included. Okay, let me type down an example of that. I need to change this. My example for that would be uh, nut, not, and nat. Okay, you have nut, not, note, and nat. Now, so you're told to avoid obscure lexical items. The problem with this is that not all sound contrasts needed may be actually included. So for example, you have nut, not, note, and nat. Can you type into the chat box what a nat is? What's a nat? What's a nat? I wonder if I discussed this with you last time. What's a nat? Don't look into the dictionary. Just the ones who know it immediately. Yes, a type of insect, but what kind of insect? Is a butterfly a gnat? Is a caterpillar a gnat? Is a praying mantis a gnat? Well, a gnat is a small flying insect. A small flying insect. So a butterfly is not a gnat. A mosquito, a fly, these are gnats. And these are something Filipinos probably would not understand. They are obscure lexical items. The problem is you cannot produce all sound contrast because nut, not, note, nat would require you to use this obscure lexical item. So maybe you should just use nut, not, note, or think of other groups, other words like but, bought, boat, bat. So there you got the actual you got the actual vowel without having a problem of using obscure lexical items. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say Avoid obscure lexical items. Okay, then also avoid elements in your pronunciation that may be irritating to your listeners, irritating or distracting to your listeners. Let me change this. Irritating or distracting or distracting. We have a distraction right now. So that's the garbage. Ay, hindi ko pala narinig. So there's a um, good, what you call this, noise reduction. See if you can hear it. There's actually a garbage truck coming. So let me pause for a while, class. Thank you for bearing with me. So, avoid elements in your pronunciation that may be irritating or distracting to your listeners. I think we discussed this a bit. My classic example would be the teacher in PNU who would pronounce Aristotle as Aristotle. And every time she would say that, students would repeat after her. Or I had a teacher who had aspiration so much that the P sounded like a K. Premier. Premier sounded like creamier. Okay. So avoid elements in your pronunciation that may be irritating or distracting to your listeners. Maybe even if it's the correct pronunciation. If it's not part of the one that you should test, then maybe you should say it like Filipinos understand it. Okay. Variation should only be in the critical sounds and not in other things like pitch. Okay. Do not involve variation in other sounds. You know, when I was taking my ROTC, my military training, we were required to do military training in college. And my commanding officer felt that we don't really need to do the tests. The test was just a formality, and so we were not really lectured. All we did was march and march and march and march and pay and buy uh, items. We were not given lectures. And so when the test came, we knew nothing at all about the test. But the the unit must produce a passing grade. Otherwise, it would reflect on the officers. So every time, every time the correct answer would be given, the commandant would change his pitch. So A, dog; B, cat; C, gorilla; D, kangaroo. So you know the correct answer by the by the change in the pitch. Okay. And he didn't even tell us. But by just doing that, oh, we know that's the correct answer. Okay. Okay. So there should be everything should be the same except the critical sound that you are checking so that there would be uniformity. Now, that's where we have the good role of recorders because sometimes you end up not performing well. For recorders, you can edit, but when you're actually doing the test, you try to edit, it adds to the confusion. Okay, so that's one advantage of using recorders. Okay, now when employing native speakers, pay attention to dialectical differences. So like when you show a video, okay class, listen to this video and write down the thing that you need to write down. Pay attention to dialectical differences. Some people pronounce things differently. Schedule, for the British, it's schedule. Pronunciation, for Canadians, it's pronunciation. Okay, and there are many other dialectical differences. I posted in my Facebook the use of punctual whenever. There was this lady who was talking about her experience, religious experience, and every time she uses the word when, she uses whenever. Instead of saying when, she uses whenever. Okay. And that could be something different for us because for us, there's a difference between when and whenever. But for her, there's no difference between when and whenever. Okay. It's called punctual whenever. So when employing native speakers, pay attention to dialectical differences. Missile, missile. Iodine, iodine. Okay. Now, be aware that some aspects of spoken speech are more testable than others. Again, some aspects of spoken speech are more testable than others. For example, stress and intonation may be more important than phoneme discrimination because the context can compensate for this. Okay, like I will I will slip tonight. I will slip in this bed tonight. So you know it's not really slip, it's sleep. Or like that lady who would give a food stub to somebody, the one she was talking to. So she said, I will I will give you a stab so you can eat. So food stub became stab. Okay. Now, stress and intonation may be more important than phoneme discrimination because the context can compensate for phoneme discrimination, but stress and intonation are harder to test than phoneme discrimination. Okay? So some aspects of the spoken language are more testable than others. Okay. So here is an example of a test of stress. Okay. Spoken. I've just given 3 books to John. I've just given 3 books to John. So write an X under the syllable with the main stress. I've just given 3 books to John. So you check 3. But then the test has very limited to the main stress because there are other stresses here. Actually, I've just given 3 books to John. Like John, that's also stressed, but I've given 3 books to John. So the others, there's some amount of stress on them, but this is limited to the main stress and there is little context. Sometimes students who don't perform well in the test perform well in actual communication because there's a lot more context. Also, you need to recognize tone, like this one. Tom is a fine goalkeeper. Again, Tom is a fine goalkeeper. The speaker is making a straightforward statement. He's being very sarcastic. He's asking a question. He's giving a command. So, like, you can say, Tom is a fine goalkeeper. Tom is a fine goal speaker. Tom is a fine goalkeeper. So when you say it like that, you're being sarcastic. Okay. So note that the same utterance can be spoken differently to indicate sarcasm, question, or a plain statement. So plain statement, Tom is a fine goalkeeper. Question, Tom is a fine goalkeeper. Sarcasm, Tom is a fine goalkeeper. So notice the tone changes the purpose of the question of the utterance. Okay. So Tom is a fine goalkeeper. This test is difficult to construct because it doesn't have much context. Vocabulary and grammar play a part. For example, the word fine may actually indicate sarcasm, even if you say it without the intonation. Okay, this one, spoken. Why are you going home? Written. A, at 6 o'clock. B, yes I am. C, to watch TV. D, by bus. What's the correct answer that you ask? Why are you going home? A, at 6 o'clock. B, yes I am. C, to watch TV. D, by bus. Well, this is an example class of a discrete point question. You're asking for a specific skill, very specific skill, okay? If the testee incorrectly heard the WH word, for example, she hears when instead of why, she will answer differently. So instead of hearing why, she hears when are you going home? Why, 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 why are you going home? Why are you going home? It sounds like when, okay? Also, the same question, why are you going home? A, at 6 o'clock. B, yes I am. C, to watch TV. D, by bus. In the same question, it's possible that the testee heard the question correctly, but she doesn't know the correct response. Thus, this test may have a problem with difficulty. Okay, it may have a problem with difficulty because it's difficult for the testee. But this kind of test is very artificial. For example, the testee does not really watch TV, yet he or she has to answer C. To watch TV. Well, I don't want people to know that I watch TV, but I have to answer this. Okay, so it's very artificial. And since this is artificial, a series of this kind of item would require the testees to change their mindset again and again. You're thinking of something, you have to change your mindset. You have to change your mindset. You have to change your mindset. And that could be confusing or difficult or stressful for testees. Okay, now there's another distraction. Wait for a while, please. Okay, there are so many artificial questions that invalidates the questions or produce unreliability. Okay, so I have the same picture. The girls are writing. B, one of the girls is wearing blue. C, one of the girls has a long skirt. D, the girls are standing. Well, obviously, the best answer would be the girls are writing. However, like I said, avoid choices that are A, number one, debatable. The girls are pretty. Are they pretty? No, they're not. Yes, they are. Or avoid choices that are not readily apparent, like the girls are happy. Are they happy? There's a girl who seems to be smiling, but maybe she's more of embarrassed. A smile can mean many different things. Like maybe she's actually embarrassed because her picture is being taken. And avoid choices that are beyond the proficiency of the testees. Also, avoid choices that are complicated in terms of vocabulary or grammar because you're not testing vocabulary, you're not testing grammar. So you minimize complications in other things. Okay. So in testing listening, some other aspects of proficiency such as vocabulary, grammar, or even non-linguistic aspects such as memory may play a part. Therefore, be careful about test construction because test validity is at stake. So, for example, you ask your students to listen to a medium in length lecture or discussion, maybe 2 minutes long, 3 minutes long, and you ask comprehension questions. Definitely memory will play a part in that test because students don't have access to the spoken text again and again. They cannot replay it, or if they replay it they can't find the right part. So vocabulary, grammar, and even memory may play a part. So be careful about test construction. Otherwise, your test validity would not be acceptable. Your test would be invalid. You're no longer testing what you're supposed to test. Okay. Testing ability to understand simple instructions. We're near the end of our discussion. A street map can be used to test listeners' ability to understand simple instructions. However, take note that spatial intelligence also plays a role in this kind of test, especially if the map is written on the board. Like you take a right, when they see something going up, they take a right, but it also depends on the direction. Because if you're going from left to right, a picture of a map, a street that's going up, that's actually going left. But if you have the same map, you have the same street going up, if your direction is from the right, going up is actually going right. Okay, so it requires a student to have spatial intelligence. So you have to be careful with using a street map. Maybe if you have a street map, it's much better to put the map on the table, not on the board. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope you understand testing listening.